The Arizona Territory stretched endlessly under the scorching sun of 1885, its red dust dancing in spirals across the weathered landscape. In the small frontier town of Cedar Ridge, nestled between towering mesas and ancient canyons, the morning air carried the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of cattle lowing in the fields. This was a place where survival meant adaptation, where the strong endured and the weak were swallowed by the unforgiving desert. Thomas Whitmore stood on the porch of his modest farmhouse, his calloused hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. At 42 years old, he bore the weathered look of a man who had spent decades battling the elements. His sun-darkened skin stretched over angular features, and his grey-streaked brown hair hung just past his collar. Deep lines etched the corners of his blue eyes, telling stories of countless sunsets watched in solitude. The farm he had carved from this harsh land was small but prosperous by frontier standards. Rows of corn and beans stretched toward the horizon, their green shoots a defiant splash of life against the amber earth. A small herd of cattle grazed in the distance, and chickens pecked at the dusty ground near the barn. It was the kind of life that required constant vigilance, endless work, and an acceptance of loneliness that had become Thomas's closest companion. But today, his attention was not on his crops or livestock. His gaze was fixed on the cluster of buildings that made up Cedar Ridge's main street, where a crowd had gathered near the general store. Even from this distance, he could hear the harsh voices carrying on the desert wind, voices filled with the kind of cruelty that frontier towns seem to breed in their darkest corners. Thomas set down his cup and stepped off the porch, his worn boots crunching on the gravel path that led toward town. He had lived in Cedar Ridge for 15 years, arriving as a young man with nothing but determination and a wagon full of farming tools. In all that time, he had learned to read the rhythms of this community, to understand the unspoken rules that governed life on the edge of civilization. The walk to town took 20 minutes, long enough for Thomas to observe the growing agitation in the crowd. As he drew closer, he could make out individual voices rising above the general murmur, voices he recognized as belonging to some of Cedar Ridge's most prominent citizens. Mayor Samuel Hutchins stood at the center of the group, his portly frame draped in a black suit that seemed perpetually dusty despite his wife's best efforts. Beside him, Sheriff Jake Morrison fingered the badge on his vest, his weathered face set in the kind of stern expression that had made him both respected and feared throughout the territory. But it was not the men who held Thomas's attention. It was the small figure huddled against the wall of the general store, a child no more than 7 or 8 years old, her dark hair hanging in tangled braids over shoulders that shook with silent sobs. Even from a distance, Thomas could see the distinctive features that marked her heritage, the bronze skin and high cheekbones that spoke of Apache blood flowing through her veins. The girl wore a simple cotton dress that had once been blue, but was now faded to the color of winter sky. Her feet were bare, dusty and scratched from running across the rocky terrain that surrounded the town. But it was her eyes that stopped Thomas in his tracks, dark eyes that held a mixture of defiance and terror, the eyes of a wild creature backed into a corner with nowhere left to run. Mayor Hutchins was speaking, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. This child has been nothing but trouble since she arrived in our town 3 days ago. She's stolen food from the bakery, frightened the horses at the livery stable, and yesterday she bit young Timothy Fletcher when he tried to catch her sleeping in his family's barn. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Thomas recognized most of the faces, hard-working people who had carved their lives from this unforgiving land, but whose faces now showed the kind of prejudice that frontier life could either temper or inflame. Martha Pembridge, the banker's wife, clutched her shawl tighter around her shoulders, as if the very sight of the child posed a threat. Dr. Edmund Hayes stood near the back of the group, his medical bag in hand, but his expression showed none of the compassion that should have marked his profession. "She's Apache," spat John Fletcher, Timothy's father, as if the word itself carried poison. You can see it in her face, in the way she moves, wild as the day is long, and twice as dangerous. Mark my words, she'll bring nothing but trouble to this town. Sheriff Morrison nodded gravely. The Apache raids have been getting worse lately. Just last month they hit the Peterson Ranch 20 miles south of here, burned the house, ran off with half the cattle. For all we know, this girl is a scout, sent to learn our weaknesses. The accusation hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire, and Thomas felt something cold settle in his stomach. He had seen this kind of fear before, the way it could transform ordinary people into something harder, crueler. The child pressed herself further against the wall, her small hands clenched into fists at her sides. "What do you propose we do?" asked Mrs. Pembridge, her voice shrill with barely contained hysteria. "We can't have a wild Indian child running loose in our town. Think of our own children, our safety." Mayor Hutchins straightened his vest, clearly relishing his role as the voice of authority. "The territorial authorities will have to be notified. There's an Indian agency 40 miles north of here. They deal with these situations." Thomas knew about the Indian agency, had heard stories from travelers passing through. It was a place where Apache children were taken to be civilized, stripped of their language, their customs, their very identity. The mortality rate among the children there was whispered about in saloons and trading posts. A shameful secret that everyone knew, but no one discussed openly. The girl seemed to understand the direction of the conversation, even if she didn't comprehend every word. Her breathing became rapid and shallow, and Thomas could see the fight-or-flight response building in her small frame. She reminded him of a young colt he had once tried to tame, all wild energy and desperate freedom. "She's just a child," Dr. Hayes said quietly, the first dissenting voice in the crowd. "Surely there's another way." "A wild child," John Fletcher corrected. "Look at her. She doesn't even speak English, probably doesn't understand a word we're saying. She's more animal than human at this point." The cruelty of the statement hit Thomas like a physical blow. He had remained silent long enough, standing on the edge of the crowd like a spectator at someone else's tragedy. But something in the girl's eyes, something in the way she held herself despite her fear, called to a place in his heart that had been empty for too long. Thomas stepped forward, his movement causing heads to turn in his direction. Conversations died away as the townspeople recognized him, the quiet farmer who kept to himself, who attended church services but rarely socialized, who had built a life of solitary dignity on the outskirts of their community. "Thomas," Mayor Hutchins said, his tone cautious, "I didn't see you there. What brings you to town this morning?" Thomas didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked slowly toward the child, his movements deliberate and non-threatening. The girl watched him approach, her dark eyes tracking his every step, but she didn't retreat further. There was something in his manner, perhaps, that spoke of safety rather than threat. When he was close enough to see the individual freckles scattered across her nose, Thomas crouched down so that his eyes were level with hers. The gesture brought him within reach of those small fists, but he showed no fear, no hesitation. For a long moment, man and child regarded each other in silence, two souls recognizing something fundamental in the other. "What's your name?" Thomas asked quietly, his voice pitched for her ears alone. The girl's lips parted slightly, but no sound emerged. Her eyes darted toward the crowd of adults, then back to Thomas's face. In that glance, he saw intelligence, wariness, and something else that made his heart constrict with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "It's all right," he continued, his tone gentle but firm. "You don't have to be afraid." From behind him, John Fletcher's voice cut through the morning air. "Don't waste your time, Whitmore. The creature doesn't speak civilized tongue, probably doesn't even have a proper name." Thomas felt anger flare in his chest, hot and sudden. He stood slowly, turning to face the crowd with an expression that made several people take an unconscious step backward. When Thomas Whitmore was truly angry, it was a sight that wise men remembered. "Her name," Thomas said, his voice carrying clearly across the dusty street, "is whatever she chooses it to be. And she is not a creature. She is a child, alone and frightened. in need of protection rather than persecution. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat diplomatically. Now, Thomas, we all understand your Christian compassion, but you must consider the practical matters. This child has no family, no means of support. She's been living like a wild animal, stealing food, sleeping rough. The proper authorities must be notified. And what will those authorities do? Thomas asked, his gaze moving from face to face in the crowd. Send her to the agency, where she'll be another statistic in their reports. Strip away everything that makes her who she is, until there's nothing left but an empty shell wearing white man's clothes. The silence that followed his words was heavy with uncomfortable truths. Everyone in Cedar Ridge knew about the Indian agencies, about the policies of forced assimilation and cultural erasure. But it was easier to support such policies in the abstract than to look into the eyes of a terrified child and see the human cost. Dr. Hayes stepped forward, his medical bag clutched in weathered hands. Thomas raises valid concerns. Perhaps there's a temporary solution while we consider our options more carefully. What kind of temporary solution? Sheriff Morrison asked, his hand still resting on his gun belt out of habit. Thomas felt the weight of every gaze in the crowd, felt the moment balanced on the edge of a decision that would change everything. Behind him, he could sense the girl's presence, could feel her watching and listening, even if she couldn't understand every word. In that moment, with the Arizona sun beating down on his shoulders and the dusty streets stretching away toward the horizon, Thomas Whitmore made the choice that would define the rest of his life. She can stay with me, he said simply. The words fell into the silence, like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock and disbelief. Mayor Hutchins's face went through several color changes, settling on a shade of red that matched the desert rocks. Mrs. Pembridge gasped audibly, her hand flying to her throat as if Thomas had suggested something indecent. Absolutely not, John Fletcher sputtered. Thomas, you're a bachelor, living alone on that farm of yours. It wouldn't be proper, and it certainly wouldn't be safe. This girl is Apache, for God's sake. Her people have been raiding settlements throughout the territory. Her people, Thomas repeated slowly, are dead. Otherwise, she wouldn't be here alone, would she? The logic of his statement was inescapable, and several members of the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Apache children didn't wander into white settlements by choice. The presence of this girl meant tragedy, loss, probably violence that no child should have witnessed. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his role as the law requiring him to address the practical concerns. Thomas, I respect what you're trying to do, but there are legal considerations. The territorial government has specific policies about Indian children. I can't just let you take her without proper documentation. What kind of documentation? Thomas asked. Adoption papers, for one thing. Proof that you're capable of providing for her, that you understand the responsibilities involved. This isn't like taking in a stray dog, Thomas. This is a human child. Yes, Thomas said firmly, she is. The emphasis he placed on those simple words carried a weight of meaning that wasn't lost on anyone present. In a place and time where Apache people were often viewed as less than human, Thomas's assertion of the girl's fundamental humanity was a radical statement. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat delicately. Perhaps we could arrange for a temporary guardianship while the proper papers are prepared. I could examine the child, assess her health and basic needs. If Thomas is serious about this undertaking, we should at least ensure she receives proper medical attention. Thomas nodded gratefully. Dr. Hayes had always been one of the more reasonable voices in Cedar Ridge, a man whose medical training had taught him to see suffering wherever it occurred, regardless of its origin. But not everyone in the crowd was ready to accept such a reasonable solution. Mrs. Pembridge's voice rose in pitch, carrying clearly across the street. This is madness. We're talking about bringing a savage into our community, housing her on a farm just miles from our own homes and children. What happens when her Apache relatives come looking for her? What happens when she reverts to her wild nature? What happens, Thomas said quietly, when we show a frightened child the same kindness we would want shown to our own children? If they were lost and alone? The question hung in the air, challenging each person present to examine their own conscience. Thomas had always been respected in Cedar Ridge, known as a man of his word, someone who kept his agreements and minded his own business. His intervention carried weight precisely because it was so unexpected. Mayor Hutchins, recognizing the shift in the crowd's mood, decided to take a more diplomatic approach. Thomas, your generous spirit is admirable, truly, but you must consider the practical aspects. Do you have any experience caring for a child, particularly a child who has been traumatized, who doesn't speak our language? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his gaze drifting past the crowd toward the distant mountains where Apache bands still roamed free. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of something deeper than mere compassion. "I've been alone on that farm for 15 years, he said. "I've watched crops fail and livestock die. I've sat through blizzards that lasted for days and droughts that went on for months. I've learned that survival isn't just about strength or determination. It's about recognizing when something precious needs protection and being willing to provide it regardless of the cost." He turned back toward the girl who had been following the conversation with the intense focus of someone whose life hung in the balance. When their eyes met, Thomas saw something flicker in her expression, a tiny spark of hope that she was trying desperately to suppress. "Besides," Thomas added, his voice carrying a note of dry humor, "I've been breaking horses and training cattle for years. I think I can manage to civilize one small girl." The joke broke some of the tension, earning a few chuckles from the crowd. But John Fletcher wasn't ready to concede defeat. He stepped forward, his face flushed with indignation. "This is all very touching, Thomas, but you're thinking with your heart instead of your head. This girl isn't some lost kitten you can take home and tame. She's Apache. Her people are our enemies. They've killed settlers, burned farms, stolen children. How do you know she won't murder you in your sleep?" Thomas looked at John Fletcher for a long moment, then turned to study the girl who stood pressed against the wall. She was small for her age, probably undernourished, with hollow cheeks and prominent collarbones visible beneath her faded dress. Her arms were thin as twigs, her hands small enough to disappear entirely in his own calloused palms. "Look at her, John," Thomas said quietly. "Really look at her. Does she look like a threat to anyone except herself?" The crowd turned as one to regard the child, seeing her perhaps for the first time as an individual rather than a symbol of their fears. She was indeed pitifully small, her dark eyes too large for her thin face, her entire posture speaking of exhaustion and barely controlled terror. Dr. Hayes approached the group, his medical bag in hand. "If we're going to proceed with this arrangement, I should examine the child immediately. She appears to be suffering from malnutrition and dehydration, among other things." Thomas nodded, then crouched down again to address the girl directly. This time, when he spoke, his voice carried a different quality, something that transcended language barriers and reached directly into the heart. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said simply. "I won't let anyone hurt you." Whether she understood his words or simply responded to his tone, something in the girl's posture shifted. The rigid fear in her shoulders eased slightly, and she took a half step away from the wall. It was a tiny movement, but in the context of her previous paralysis, it felt monumental. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his expression thoughtful. "Thomas, if you're serious about this, we'll need to do things properly. I'll send word to the territorial authorities, explain the situation, but until we hear back from them, I'm willing to grant you temporary custody under Dr. Hayes' supervision. And I'll prepare the necessary medical reports," Dr. Hayes added. "The child will need regular checkups, proper nutrition, and time to recover from whatever trauma she's experienced." Mayor Hutchins looked less than pleased with the turn of events, but he was a politician who understood which way the wind was blowing. "Very well. But Thomas, you must understand that this arrangement comes with significant responsibilities. The child will need to be educated, taught proper English, integrated into our community's standards of behavior. She'll need to learn our ways if she's going to survive here," Mrs. Pembridge added, her tone slightly less hysterical than before. Proper dress, proper manners, proper Christian values. Thomas felt the girl tense beside him at the harsh tone in the woman's voice. Without thinking, he placed a gentle hand on her shoulder, offering what comfort he could. She didn't pull away from his touch, which he took as a positive sign. "She'll learn what she needs to learn," Thomas said carefully. "But she won't be forced to forget who she is in the process." It was another radical statement for its time and place. The idea that an Apache child might retain some connection to her original culture while adapting to white society. Several people in the crowd exchanged uncertain glances, clearly uncomfortable with the implications. John Fletcher shook his head in disgust. "You're making a mistake, Thomas. A mistake that could cost you your life, and maybe the lives of your neighbors as well. When this all goes wrong, don't expect the rest of us to come running to help you." With that parting shot, Fletcher turned and stalked away, his heavy boots raising small clouds of dust with each step. Several other members of the crowd began to disperse as well, their curiosity satisfied and their opinions clearly stated. But a few remained, including Dr. Hayes and Sheriff Morrison. The doctor approached the girl slowly, his manner professional but kind. "I need to examine you, child," he said gently, "to make sure you're not injured or seriously ill. I won't hurt you, I promise." The girl's eyes darted between Dr. Hayes and Thomas, seeking guidance. Thomas nodded encouragingly. "It's all right," he said. "Dr. Hayes is a good man. He wants to help you feel better." Gradually, with infinite patience, Dr. Hayes conducted a basic examination right there on the street. The girl submitted to his gentle probing with the resigned patience of someone who had learned not to resist adult authority. But her eyes never left Thomas's face. "Malnutrition, dehydration, several minor cuts and bruises," Dr. Hayes reported quietly to Thomas. "Nothing that won't heal with proper care and nutrition. But Thomas, this child has been through significant trauma. Physical healing is just the beginning. The psychological damage may take much longer to address." Thomas nodded grimly. He had suspected as much from the girl's behavior, the way she held herself, the carefully controlled terror in her eyes. "What happened to her family?" he asked quietly. Dr. Hayes shook his head. "I don't know, and I'm not sure we should try to find out right now. Whatever it was, it left her alone and traumatized. Pushing for details might do more harm than good." Sheriff Morrison joined their quiet conference. "There have been reports of Apache bands moving through the territory over the past few weeks. Could be they were fleeing cavalry patrols. Could be they were relocating to avoid conflicts with other tribes. Civilian casualties." He shrugged, leaving the sentence unfinished. The implication was clear enough. In the complex and violent world of frontier conflicts, Apache families often found themselves caught between military forces, competing tribes, and white settlers. The fact that this girl had survived to reach Cedar Ridge suggested both tragedy and remarkable resilience. "The important thing now," Dr. Hayes said, closing his medical bag, "is providing stability and safety. This child needs routine, proper nutrition, and above all, she needs to know that she's not in danger anymore." Thomas looked down at the girl, who was watching the adult's conversation with the focused attention of someone trying to understand her own fate. In her dark eyes, he saw intelligence, strength, and a kind of patient endurance that spoke of wisdom far beyond her years. "What's your name?" he asked her again, this time making the question a gentle invitation rather than a demand. For a long moment, the girl was silent. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke a single word in what Thomas assumed was Apache. The word was musical, flowing, nothing like the harsh consonants of English. "That's a beautiful name," Thomas said, though he had no idea what it meant. "Can you say it again?" The girl repeated the word, her pronunciation careful and precise. Then, with obvious effort, she attempted to translate or explain, pointing to herself and repeating the Apache word, followed by halting English syllables that didn't quite form coherent words. Dr. Hayes smiled encouragingly. "She understands more English than she can speak." That's common among children who've had limited exposure to a new language. With time and patience, her vocabulary will improve. Thomas crouched down once more, bringing himself to the girl's eye level. "I'm Thomas," he said, pointing to himself. "Thomas." He repeated his name several times, then pointed to her and attempted to pronounce the Apache word she had given him. His pronunciation was clumsy, clearly foreign to his tongue, but the girl's eyes widened with something that might have been pleased surprise. She repeated her name again, more clearly this time, then attempted to say Thomas with her own unique inflection. The exchange was simple, basic, but it felt like a bridge being built across an enormous chasm. For the first time since he had arrived in town that morning, Thomas felt a flicker of hope that this impossible situation might actually work. Sheriff Morrison cleared his throat, bringing them back to practical matters. "Thomas, if you're taking the child home today, there are a few things we need to address. I'll need to know where you'll be, how to contact you if there are any legal developments, and you'll need to bring her to town regularly so Dr. Hayes can monitor her progress. Once a week at minimum," Dr. Hayes added. "More often if any problems arise. And Thomas, if she becomes ill, or if her behavior suggests that she's not adjusting well, you must bring her to me immediately." Thomas nodded his understanding. He was beginning to grasp the full scope of what he had committed himself to, the weight of responsibility that came with caring for a traumatized child. But when he looked at the girl, saw the way she was watching him with cautious hope, he felt no regret. "We should go," he said finally. "She needs food, rest, and time to adjust to everything that's happened." The girl seemed to understand that a decision had been made, that her immediate future had been determined. She looked around the nearly empty street, at the few remaining townspeople who were still watching with curious eyes, then back at Thomas. Without a word, she stepped away from the wall and moved to stand beside him. It was a small gesture, but it spoke volumes about trust beginning to take root despite fear and uncertainty. Thomas felt something shift in his chest, an emotion he hadn't experienced in years. Looking down at this small, brave child who had just placed her fragile trust in his hands, he realized that his life had just changed in ways he couldn't begin to imagine. The walk back to the farm was conducted in silence, but it was a different kind of quiet than the tense atmosphere of the town square. The girl walked beside Thomas with small, measured steps, her eyes constantly scanning their surroundings with the alertness of someone accustomed to danger. She stayed close enough to him that their shadows merged on the dusty path, but not so close as to impede his movement. Thomas found himself adjusting his normally brisk pace to accommodate her shorter legs, and he noticed how she favored her left foot slightly, probably due to cuts or bruises on the sole. He made a mental note to ask Dr. Hayes about proper foot care when they returned to town for her next examination. The farm buildings came into view as they topped a small rise, the house and barn looking exactly as Thomas had left them that morning, though somehow everything felt different now. He was seeing his home through the eyes of a child who had been living rough, wondering what she would make of the simple but comfortable life he had built for himself. The girl stopped walking when she caught sight of the farm, her head tilted slightly as she took in the scene. Thomas followed her gaze, trying to see what she was seeing, the neat rows of crops stretching toward the horizon, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the chickens pecking in the yard near the barn. "This is home," Thomas said quietly, the word carrying more weight than he had intended. The girl looked up at him, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw something other than fear or wariness in her expression. There was curiosity there, perhaps even a tiny flicker of interest in her new surroundings. As they approached the house, the farm's border collie, Rex, came bounding around the corner of the barn, his tail wagging with the uncomplicated joy that dogs brought to every homecoming. But when he caught sight of the girl, Rex stopped short, his head cocked in the universal canine expression of puzzlement. The girl went rigid at the sight of the dog, her small hands clenching into fists at her sides. Thomas realized that she probably hadn't had many positive experiences with dogs, given that they were often used by cavalry units and bounty hunters to track Apache bands. "Easy, Rex," Thomas said calmly, holding up one hand to signal the dog to stay where he was. "This is our guest. You need to be gentle with her." Rex, who had been Thomas's companion for 6 years, was intelligent enough to pick up on the serious tone in his master's voice. The dog sat down where he was, his tail still wagging, but his posture respectful and non-threatening. Thomas knelt down beside the girl, speaking in the same calm voice he used with skittish horses. "Rex won't hurt you. He's a good dog, very gentle with anything smaller than himself, but if you're not comfortable with him yet, that's all right too." The girl's eyes moved between Thomas and the dog, clearly trying to assess the level of threat. Rex, as if sensing her fear, lay down completely, resting his head on his paws and making himself as small and non-threatening as possible. After a long moment, the girl took a tentative step forward, then another. Rex remained perfectly still, allowing her to approach at her own pace. When she was close enough, she extended one small hand toward the dog, palm down in the gesture that Thomas had taught Rex to recognize as a greeting. Rex sniffed her hand delicately, then gave it the gentlest of licks. The girl jerked her hand back reflexively, but then, to Thomas's amazement, the corner of her mouth twitched upward in what might have been the beginning of a smile. It was such a small thing, that almost smile, but it felt like a victory of enormous proportions. Thomas realized that he had been holding his breath, watching this first fragile connection between his new ward and his faithful companion. "He likes you," Thomas said simply. "Rex is a good judge of character." The girl looked up at him, and Thomas saw a question in her eyes that transcended language barriers. She was asking, without words, if this place was safe, if these creatures, man and dog, could be trusted with her fragile survival. "You're safe here," Thomas said, the promise carrying all the weight he could give it. "No one will hurt you while you're under my protection." Lodu, whether she understood his words or simply read the sincerity in his voice, something in the girl's posture relaxed slightly. She was still alert, still ready to run if necessary, but the rigid terror that had characterized her earlier behavior was beginning to ease. Thomas stood and gestured toward the house. "Come on, you must be hungry, and we need to get you cleaned up and fed properly." The farmhouse was simple but comfortable, reflecting 15 years of a bachelor's practical improvements. The main room served as both kitchen and living area, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a large wooden table occupying the center of the space. Shelves lined the walls, holding books, tools, and the accumulated necessities of frontier life. The girl stopped just inside the doorway, her eyes wide as she took in her surroundings. Thomas realized that this might be the first permanent structure she had been inside in weeks or even months. The concept of walls, of enclosed space, might feel foreign or even threatening after so much time living under the open sky. "It's all right," Thomas said gently. "You can explore if you want to. Everything here is safe." Instead of exploring, the girl remained near the door, her body language suggesting that she was memorizing the location of her escape route. Thomas understood her caution and made no move to close the door or block her path. "Are you hungry?" he asked, moving slowly toward the kitchen area. "I have bread, cheese, some dried meat. Not fancy, but it's filling." The girl's eyes followed his movements as he gathered food from his stores, setting out portions on a clean plate. When he placed the plate on the table and gestured for her to join him, she approached with careful steps, her gaze never leaving his face. The way she ate told Thomas volumes about her recent experiences. She consumed the food quickly but quietly, with the focused intensity of someone who had learned not to waste opportunities for nourishment. There was no pleasure in the act, no indication that she tasted what she was eating. It was simply fuel, consumed as efficiently as possible in case the opportunity was suddenly taken away. Thomas found himself oddly moved by this pragmatic approach to survival. This child had learned lessons that no child should have to learn, had developed skills that spoke of desperation and loss. Yet she had survived, had made it to safety through her own resourcefulness and determination. When she had finished eating, the girl looked up at Thomas with an expression that might have been gratitude, though it was still heavily tempered with wariness. He smiled at her, the first genuine smile he had managed since this whole situation began. "Better?" he asked. She nodded slightly, the gesture barely perceptible, but clearly affirmative. It was another small victory, another tiny bridge across the chasm of language and cultural difference. Thomas stood and moved to a cabinet near the window, withdrawing a clean basin and a bar of soap. "You need to get cleaned up," he said, bringing the items to the table. "There's a well outside where we can get fresh water." The girl watched his preparations with the focused attention she seemed to bring to everything, trying to understand what was expected of her. When Thomas gestured toward the door, she followed him outside to the well, her bare feet silent on the wooden porch. The well was Thomas's pride, a deep shaft that provided clear, cold water year-round. He worked the pump handle, filling the basin with water that sparkled in the afternoon sunlight. The girl approached the well cautiously, peering down into its depths with obvious curiosity. "It goes down about 40 feet, Thomas explained, following her gaze. "Took me 2 months to dig it when I first settled here, but it's never run dry, not even in the worst drought years." He didn't expect her to understand the technical details, but something in his tone seemed to convey pride and accomplishment. The girl looked from the well to Thomas's face, and he thought he saw a flicker of respect in her dark eyes. The process of getting her cleaned up was conducted with careful attention to her modesty and comfort. Thomas provided soap and clean cloths, then retreated to give her privacy while she washed. When she emerged from behind the barn, where he had set up a washing area, her transformation was remarkable. Without the accumulated dirt and dust of her travels, the girl's natural beauty was evident. Her skin had a warm bronze tone that spoke of mixed heritage, and her dark hair, when clean and properly combed, fell in soft waves past her shoulders. But it was her eyes that captured Thomas's attention, dark and intelligent, holding depths that seemed far older than her years. The dress she wore was still faded and worn, but at least it was clean now. Thomas made a mental note to ask Mrs. Hayes about obtaining proper clothing for a growing child. He suspected that the doctor's wife, despite her husband's more liberal attitudes, might have opinions about dressing Apache children in white fashion. "Much better," Thomas said approvingly. "Now, we need to talk about sleeping arrangements." He led her back into the house, gesturing toward a small room off the main living area. "This used to be a storage room, but I can clear it out, set up a proper bed. It's got a window for light and air, and it's close enough to the main room that you won't feel isolated." The girl peered into the small space, taking in its dimensions and features with the same careful assessment she applied to everything else. Thomas found himself wondering what kind of sleeping arrangements she was accustomed to, whether the concept of a private room felt welcoming or threatening. "Or," he continued, "if you'd prefer to sleep in the main room near the fireplace, that would be fine too. Whatever makes you feel safest." The word safest seemed to resonate with her. She looked up at Thomas with an expression that was beginning to show traces of trust mixed with her habitual caution. Over the following hours, as the afternoon sun began to slant toward evening, Thomas found himself adjusting to the presence of another person in his carefully ordered world. The girl followed him as he completed his daily chores, watching intently as he fed the chickens, milked the cow, and checked on the cattle in the distant pasture. She seemed particularly fascinated by the chickens, perhaps because they were small and manageable in a way that the larger farm animals were not. When one of the hens approached her boldly, looking for scattered feed, the girl remained perfectly still, allowing the bird to peck at the ground near her feet. Thomas watched this interaction with growing interest. The girl's stillness wasn't born of fear, but of understanding. She had grasped intuitively that sudden movements would startle the chickens, that patience would yield better results than force. It was a sophisticated understanding of animal behavior, suggesting that her Apache upbringing had included extensive knowledge of the natural world. "You understand animals," Thomas observed quietly. "That's a valuable skill on a farm." The girl glanced up at him, and he saw a flash of something that might have been pride in her expression. It was the first time he had seen her react positively to praise, the first indication that she valued recognition of her abilities. As evening approached, Thomas found himself facing the practical challenges of his new situation. The girl had no proper clothes beyond the faded dress she wore, no personal possessions of any kind. She was entirely dependent on his ability to provide for her basic needs, a responsibility that felt both daunting and strangely natural. "Tomorrow we'll go to town," Thomas said as they sat at his kitchen table for a simple dinner of bread, cheese and vegetables from his garden. "We need to get you proper clothes, shoes, maybe some things to make your room more comfortable." The girl's reaction to the mention of returning to town was immediate and unmistakable. Her entire body tensed, and the careful trust she had been building throughout the day seemed to evaporate instantly. She pushed back from the table slightly, her eyes darting toward the open door as if calculating her chances of escape. Thomas realized his mistake immediately. To the girl, town represented danger, hostility, the very real threat of being taken away from the fragile safety she had found. The crowd of adults discussing her fate, the harsh voices and suspicious stares, all of that would be fresh in her memory. "Or maybe not tomorrow," Thomas said quickly, keeping his voice calm and reassuring. "There's no hurry. We can wait until you're ready." The tension in her posture eased slightly, but didn't disappear entirely. Thomas realized that rebuilding trust would be a delicate process, one that required patience and careful attention to her emotional state. "I won't take you anywhere you don't want to go," he continued, "and I'll never leave you alone with people who might hurt you. That's a promise." The girl studied his face intently, as if trying to read the truth of his words in his expression. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her, because she gradually relaxed back into her chair and resumed eating. As the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Thomas found himself contemplating the magnitude of the change that had entered his life. This morning, he had been a solitary farmer, content with his quiet existence and predictable routines. Now he was responsible for a traumatized child whose very presence challenged everything his community believed about race, culture, and belonging. The girl had grown quiet as darkness approached, her earlier alertness giving way to something that looked suspiciously like exhaustion. Thomas realized that the emotional strain of the day, combined with her recent experiences of living rough, had probably pushed her beyond her physical limits. "You need sleep," he said gently. "Real sleep, in a safe place." He had prepared the small storage room as best he could with the materials at hand, clearing out the accumulated tools and supplies to make space for a simple bed constructed from a wooden frame and a mattress stuffed with prairie grass and old blankets. It wasn't luxurious, but it was clean and comfortable by frontier standards. The girl approached the room cautiously, examining every corner and shadow with the thoroughness of someone who had learned that safety was never guaranteed. When she seemed satisfied that there were no hidden threats, she turned to Thomas with a questioning look. "This is your room," Thomas said. "Your private space. No one will come in without your permission." The concept of privacy, of having a space that belonged entirely to her, seemed to be foreign to the girl's experience. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, simply looking at the small room as if she couldn't quite believe it was real. "I'll be right outside if you need anything," Thomas continued. "Just call out and I'll hear you." The girl nodded slowly, then stepped into the room and closed the door behind her. Thomas heard the soft sounds of movement from within, the creaking of the makeshift bed as she settled onto it. Then silence fell over the farmhouse, a deeper quiet than Thomas had experienced in years. He sat at his kitchen table for a long time after that, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace and contemplating the day's events. In the space of a few hours, his entire life had been restructured around the needs of a child he had never seen before. It should have felt overwhelming, possibly even foolish. Instead, it felt oddly right, as if some missing piece of his existence had finally clicked into place. Thomas had never married, never had children of his own. There had been opportunities over the years, women in town who had made their interest known, but somehow he had never felt compelled to pursue those possibilities. He had told himself that he was content with his solitary life, that he needed no one else to feel complete. Now, listening to the soft breathing from the small room where the Apache girl slept, Thomas wondered if he had been lying to himself all along. Perhaps his contentment had been nothing more than resignation, a settling for less than what life might offer if he was brave enough to reach for it. The next morning brought new challenges and small revelations. Thomas woke before dawn, as was his habit, and began his morning routine of checking on the animals and assessing the day's work ahead. But when he glanced toward the girl's room, he found the door standing open and the bed empty. For a moment, panic gripped him. Had she run away during the night? Had the reality of living among white people proven too frightening for her to endure? Thomas hurried outside, Rex at his heels, scanning the yard and surrounding fields for any sign of movement. He found her sitting on a low ridge, about 100 yards from the house, her knees drawn up to her chest, watching the sunrise paint the eastern sky in shades of pink and gold. She had wrapped one of his old blankets around her shoulders, and her dark hair stirred gently in the morning breeze. Thomas approached slowly, not wanting to startle her or interrupt what was clearly a moment of private communion with the natural world. When he was close enough to speak without raising his voice, he stopped and waited for her to acknowledge his presence. "Beautiful morning," he said quietly. The girl turned to look at him, and Thomas was struck by the transformation in her expression. Away from the tensions and fears of human interaction, surrounded by the vast open landscape that had shaped her earliest years, she looked more at peace than he had yet seen her. "You're an early riser," Thomas continued, settling onto the ground beside her with careful attention to maintaining a respectful distance. "That's good. Farm life starts before the sun comes up." The girl pointed toward the horizon, where the sun was climbing steadily into the clear sky, then spoke a few words in Apache. Her tone was soft, almost reverent, and Thomas got the impression that she was sharing something important about her relationship with the natural world. "Is that a prayer?" he asked gently. She looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected him to recognize the spiritual nature of her words. After a moment, she nodded slowly. Thomas felt honored that she had chosen to share this glimpse into her inner life, her connection to traditions and beliefs that had sustained her through unimaginable hardships. It reinforced his growing conviction that this child possessed depths of strength and wisdom that her harsh treatment in town had completely failed to recognize. "My people have morning prayers too," Thomas said. "Different words, but I think maybe the same feelings. Gratitude for another day, hope for the challenges ahead." The girl studied his face with that intense attention he was beginning to recognize as characteristic of her approach to understanding the world around her. She seemed to be assessing not just his words, but his sincerity, his worthiness to be trusted with her most private thoughts. Gradually, as the sun climbed higher and the morning air warmed around them, she began to relax in his presence. By the time Thomas suggested they return to the house for breakfast, she was walking beside him, with something approaching companionship rather than mere acceptance of his protection. The days that followed established a pattern of gradual trust-building and careful adaptation. Thomas modified his daily routines to include the girl in his activities, teaching her about farm work while respecting her need to move at her own pace. She proved to be an eager student, absorbing information about crops, animals, and frontier survival with the focused intensity of someone whose life had depended on rapid learning. Her English vocabulary began to expand as well, though she remained largely silent around other people. With Thomas in the safety of the farm, she began to venture simple words and phrases, her pronunciation careful and deliberate. When she made mistakes, she would look to him for correction, with an expression of serious concentration that reminded him of students he had known in his own school days back east. The girl's Apache name proved difficult for Thomas to pronounce correctly, despite her patient attempts to teach him. Eventually, she began responding to Anna, a name Thomas suggested because it sounded somewhat similar to the first syllable of her Apache name. Whether she actually liked the name or simply accepted it as a practical necessity, Thomas couldn't tell, but she didn't object to its use. 3 weeks after Anna's arrival at the farm, Dr. Hayes made an unannounced visit, riding up the dusty path on his elderly mare, with his medical bag secured behind his saddle. Thomas had been expecting such a visit, knowing that the doctor would want to assess Anna's progress and the success of their unusual arrangement. Anna's reaction to Dr. Hayes' arrival was immediate and telling. At the sound of approaching hoofbeats, she vanished from the yard where she had been helping Thomas repair a section of fence. By the time the doctor dismounted and called out his greeting, she was nowhere to be seen. "Anna," Thomas called quietly. "It's Dr. Hayes. You remember him from town?" There was no response, but Thomas caught a glimpse of movement near the barn that suggested she was watching from concealment. He understood her caution. Dr. Hayes represented the outside world, the community that had viewed her with suspicion and fear. Despite the doctor's kind treatment of her, Anna would need time to feel safe in his presence. "How has she been adjusting?" Dr. Hayes asked, as Thomas invited him into the house for coffee and a report on Anna's progress. "Better than I expected," Thomas replied honestly. "She's intelligent, eager to learn, and surprisingly resilient. The nightmares have been decreasing, and she's starting to show real interest in the farm work." Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly. "Physical health? Much improved. Regular meals, clean water, proper rest. She's already gained weight and color. The cuts on her feet have healed completely. And psychologically, any signs of violent behavior, attempts to run away, difficulty with authority?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "She's cautious around strangers, but that's perfectly understandable given her experiences. With me, she's cooperative and responsive. I think she's beginning to feel safe here." As if summoned by their conversation, Anna appeared in the doorway, her posture alert but not actively fearful. She had learned to read Thomas's emotional state with remarkable accuracy, and his calm demeanor during the conversation with Dr. Hayes seemed to have reassured her that this visit posed no immediate threat. "Hello, Anna," Dr. Hayes said gently, making no move to approach her. "You look much healthier than when I last saw you." Anna glanced at Thomas, seeking guidance on how to respond. At his encouraging nod, she stepped into the room and offered Dr. Hayes a polite greeting in English. "Very good," the doctor said approvingly. "Your English is improving rapidly." The examination that followed was conducted with infinite patience and respect for Anna's comfort level. Dr. Hayes had clearly given thought to how traumatized children might react to medical procedures, and he explained everything he was doing in simple terms while giving Anna every opportunity to indicate if she wanted him to stop. His report, when the examination was complete, was overwhelmingly positive. Anna had gained 12 pounds since her arrival at the farm. Her reflexes were normal, and she showed no signs of the diseases that commonly affected children living in poor conditions. Most importantly, her psychological state appeared stable and improving. "Thomas," Dr. Hayes said as he prepared to leave, "I must say that what you've accomplished here is remarkable. This child was in desperate condition when she arrived in Cedar Ridge. The transformation is quite extraordinary." Thomas felt a flush of pride at the doctor's praise, but he was careful not to let it show too obviously in front of Anna. She was still building her confidence, still learning to trust that the adults in her life would not abandon or betray her. "She's done most of the work herself," Thomas replied. "I've just provided a safe place for her to heal." Dr. Hayes mounted his horse and gathered the reins, but before departing, he leaned down to address Anna directly. "Anna, you're a very brave girl," he said seriously, "and you're fortunate to have found someone who recognizes your worth. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Anna watched the doctor ride away until he disappeared over the ridge, her expression thoughtful. When she turned back to Thomas, there was a question in her eyes that he couldn't quite interpret. "Dr. Hayes is a good man," Thomas said. "He wants to help you, just like I do." Anna nodded slowly, but Thomas sensed that she was processing something deeper than his simple explanation. Perhaps she was beginning to understand that there were people in the white world who could see past her Apache heritage to recognize her individual humanity. That evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky, Anna surprised Thomas by initiating a conversation in her halting English. "Thomas," she said carefully, the pronunciation of his name still slightly uncertain. Why you help me?" It was the first direct question she had asked him, the first indication that she was ready to explore the motivations behind his unexpected kindness. Thomas considered his answer carefully, knowing that his response might shape her understanding of their relationship for years to come. "Because you needed help," he said simply, "and because I could provide it." Anna frowned slightly, clearly not satisfied with such a basic explanation. "Many people, they not help. They afraid, they angry." Thomas nodded, acknowledging the truth of her observation. Yes, some people are afraid of what they don't understand, but fear makes people do cruel things sometimes. That doesn't make the cruelty right. "You not afraid?" Anna asked. Thomas looked at her, this small, brave child who had survived experiences that would have broken many adults, and felt something shift in his chest. "Of you?" "No, Anna. I'm not afraid of you." She studied his face in the starlight, seeking confirmation of his sincerity. Whatever she found there seemed to satisfy her, because she relaxed against the porch railing with something approaching contentment. "I think," she said slowly, working out the English words with careful deliberation, "I think maybe I'm safe here." It was a tentative statement, hedged with uncertainty, but it represented a monumental shift from the terrified child who had cowered against the wall in Cedar Ridge just 3 weeks earlier. Thomas felt a warmth spread through his chest that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Yes," he said quietly, "you're safe here, for as long as you want to stay." The promise hung in the air between them, witnessed by the vast star-filled sky that stretched endlessly over the Arizona territory. It was a promise that would bind them together through challenges neither of them could yet imagine, a commitment that would transform both their lives in ways that defied the prejudices and expectations of their time. But that night, sitting on the porch of the small farmhouse where 2 lonely souls had found unexpected family, the future seemed full of possibility rather than peril. Anna was learning to be a child again, slowly shedding the hypervigilance that had kept her alive during her darkest hours. And Thomas was discovering that his capacity for love had not withered during his years of solitude, but had simply been waiting for the right person to nurture and protect. As the weeks turned into months, Anna's transformation continued to astonish everyone who witnessed it. Her English vocabulary expanded rapidly, aided by Thomas's patient instruction and her own determination to master this new language. She learned to read using Thomas's small collection of books, starting with simple primers and gradually working her way up to more complex texts. But it was her adaptation to farm life that truly impressed Thomas. Anna possessed an intuitive understanding of animals that went far beyond anything he had expected. She could calm a skittish horse with a touch, predict weather changes by observing the behavior of cattle, and identify potential problems with crops before they became serious threats to the harvest. Her Apache heritage, rather than being a liability as the townspeople had assumed, proved to be an invaluable asset on the frontier farm. She knew which wild plants were edible, how to track animals across difficult terrain, and how to read the subtle signs in nature that warned of danger or promised good fortune. Thomas found himself learning from Anna as much as he taught her, gaining insights into the natural world that his European-American upbringing had never provided. Together, they developed new techniques for conserving water during dry periods, protecting crops from wind damage, and maximizing the productivity of their limited resources. The transformation was not without its challenges. Anna still suffered from occasional nightmares, waking in the middle of the night with cries in Apache that spoke of terrors Thomas could only imagine. During these episodes, he would sit with her until the fear passed, offering comfort through his presence rather than attempting to probe into traumatic memories she wasn't ready to share. There were also moments when her Apache instincts clashed with the expectations of white frontier society. She had been raised to move silently through the world, to take only what was needed, to live in harmony with natural cycles rather than trying to dominate them. Some of these values conflicted with the agricultural practices Thomas had learned, leading to discussions and compromises as they worked out an approach that honored both their backgrounds. But perhaps the most significant challenge came from the outside world, from the community of Cedar Ridge that watched their unusual household with a mixture of curiosity, suspicion, and outright hostility. Not everyone was pleased with the success of Thomas's experiment in cross-cultural adoption. The first serious challenge came on a hot afternoon in late summer, when Anna had been living on the farm for nearly 4 months. Thomas was working in the fields, harvesting the last of the corn crop, when he heard the sound of multiple horses approaching at a rapid pace. Anna, who had been helping him load harvested ears into a wagon, immediately went still at the sound. Her Apache-trained senses had identified the rhythmic hoofbeats as belonging to a group of riders moving with purpose, possibly hostile intent. "Go to the house," Thomas said quietly, his own instincts telling him that this visit was unlikely to be friendly. "Stay inside until I come for you." Anna nodded and melted away toward the farmhouse with the silent grace that still amazed Thomas. By the time the riders came into view, she had vanished completely, leaving no trace of her presence in the field. The group consisted of 5 men, all of whom Thomas recognized as residents of Cedar Ridge. John Fletcher rode at their head, his face set in the harsh lines of a man convinced of his own righteousness. Behind him came Mayor Hutchins, Sheriff Morrison, and 2 other men whose names Thomas knew, but whose business he had never been particularly interested in conducting. Thomas continued working as they approached, giving no indication that their arrival had caused him any concern. Only when they had dismounted and formed a semicircle around him did he straighten up and acknowledge their presence. "Gentlemen," he said calmly, "what brings you out to my farm on such a hot afternoon?" John Fletcher stepped forward, his role as spokesman apparently assumed rather than elected. "Thomas, we need to talk about the Indian girl." "Her name is Anna," Thomas replied evenly, "and I'm listening." Fletcher's jaw tightened at the correction. "The girl's name is irrelevant. What matters is that her presence here is causing problems for the entire community." Thomas set down the corn he had been holding and gave the group his full attention. "What kind of problems?" Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat diplomatically. "Thomas, there have been reports of increased Apache activity in the area over the past several weeks. Cattle missing from ranches to the south, signs of war parties moving through the territory. Some people are concerned that the girl's presence might be attracting unwanted attention from her people." It was a carefully worded accusation, designed to sound reasonable while placing the blame for Apache raids on Anna's mere existence. Thomas felt anger begin to build in his chest, hot and dangerous. "Are you suggesting that Apache war parties are tracking Anna to my farm?" he asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Sheriff Morrison stepped forward, his hand resting on his gun belt, in a gesture that was probably unconscious but unmistakably threatening. "Thomas, we're not making accusations. We're just saying that maybe it's time to reconsider this arrangement for everyone's safety." "Including Anna's safety?" Thomas asked. "The Indian agency has been notified about the girl," Fletcher said bluntly. "They're sending representatives to collect her within the next few weeks. It would be better for everyone if you cooperated with the process rather than forcing them to take more direct action." The threat was clear, even though it was wrapped in bureaucratic language. Thomas understood that he was being given an ultimatum: surrender Anna voluntarily or have her taken by force. Thomas looked at each man in turn, reading the mixture of fear, prejudice, and genuine concern in their faces. These were not evil men for the most part. They were simply products of their time and place, shaped by assumptions and beliefs that made it impossible for them to see Anna as anything other than a threat to their community's stability. "Anna is under my legal guardianship," Thomas said finally. "Dr. Hayes has documented her progress, her health, her adaptation to life here. She poses no threat to anyone." "Legal guardianship," Fletcher scoffed. "Thomas, you're a bachelor farmer trying to raise an Apache child. Do you really think any territorial court is going to support that arrangement when it comes under scrutiny?" It was a valid point, and Thomas knew it. His guardianship of Anna existed more through community tolerance than legal authority. If the territorial government decided to intervene, his options for resistance would be extremely limited. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Thomas said. Mayor Hutchins stepped forward, adopting his most reasonable political tone. "We're asking you to consider what's best for everyone involved, including the girl. The Indian Agency has experience dealing with Apache children. They can provide her with education, proper cultural training, preparation for life in white society. Here, isolated on your farm, she's not being prepared for the realities she'll face as an adult." Thomas felt the weight of their arguments, the reasonable-sounding justifications for tearing Anna away from the only stability she had known since the destruction of her Apache family. But he also remembered the terror in her eyes when she had first arrived in Cedar Ridge, the way she had flinched from every raised voice and sudden movement. "Have any of you asked Anna what she wants?" Thomas said quietly. The question seemed to catch the group off guard. Fletcher's face reddened with indignation. "Asked her? Thomas, she's a child, and an Apache child at that. She doesn't have the capacity to understand what's in her best interest." "She understands more than you think," Thomas replied. "She speaks English now, reads simple books, helps manage this farm with skill that would impress any of you. She's not the wild savage you're also afraid of." Sheriff Morris